Okay, welcome everyone to the September 2019 Fresh School Health and Nutrition webinar. I request you all to mute yourselves if you're not speaking. You get sound and you can hear me. I'm Venkatesh from the children. A brief introduction about the Fresh partnership, which is an interagency partnership on school health and development in low and middle income contexts. As a community of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in education and health, we host webinars every March, 3 weeks from now. While the theme for this year is suicide prevention, attention, emotional or SE, mental health and well-being, happens through a variety of situations during childhood. Schools in particular have a very important role in building children's social and emotional skills, their ability to manage their emotions, their motivation to learn and avoid. To talk about how Save the Children supports social and emotional learning in emergency contexts and its iSELA tool to measure outcomes related to SEL, colleagues from Save the Children Iraq and USA join us today. Now to introducing our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Alison Kruper, who's a senior specialist in learning research at Save the Children US. Alison specifically supports education in emergencies research and focuses on out-of-school and overage learners. She has a PhD in lifelong learning and comparative and international education from Penn State University. Welcome, Alison. Our second speaker is Chiara Moroni, who is an education specialist at Save the Children Iraq, where she oversees the quality of education programs and contributes to building capacity of national staff and programs. In the last 5 years, Chiara has worked in the education sector at various levels and in different countries, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her education background is in conflict transformation and nonviolence, with a focus on community engagement and protection. Welcome, Chiara. And speaking to us from the field in Iraq is Daud Mohammed, an education officer from the Duhok Field Office. Daud implements education and SEL activities and recently piloted the iSELA tool in Duhok. Daud holds a BSc, Bachelor of Science in Aviation Engineering. Welcome, Daud, and welcome to all us, all your colleagues joining in from Iraq. It's great to have you all with us today. I'll now hand it over to Alison to get us started off with the webinar, and a gentle reminder to our listeners to keep yourselves muted through the presentation. If you have any questions during their talk, please type them into the chat box. Thank you. Alison,
thank you, Mohini. It's wonderful to be here. Just to quickly introduce our presentation, we're first going to review the social and emotional learning programming in Iraq with Chiara. Then I will discuss the background of the International Social and Emotional Learning Assessment, iSELA, and Daud in Iraq will describe the pilot in practice, which we did in February of this year. I'll then summarize our findings, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So Chiara, I'll turn it over to you. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks everybody for being here today. I hope you can hear me. The connection in Iraq is not really the best. First, I would like to start from the title of the webinar, Children's Social and Emotional Well-Being. Child well-being is broadly concerned with how happy, healthy, and satisfied children are. And well-being is not something static, but is actually emerged from how children interact with their family, communities, and the world around them at different levels in their lives. We can identify 3 domains as part of the well-being framework: skills and knowledge, such as peer communication, making good choices; emotional well-being, that includes a sense of control and hope for the future, self-worth; and social well-being, like the ability to interact, solve a problem with others, and sense of belonging. SEL, social emotional learning, refer exactly to these 3 domains. As defined by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, SEL is the process through which children and young people acquire and effectively apply 5 specific skills area that are listed in the slide. The first one... Sorry? No? Yeah. So the first one is set and achieve positive goals, which is also named self-awareness. The second is manage emotion, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations, which is then self-management. Feel and show empathy for others, social awareness. Establish and maintain positive relationship. And the last one, make responsible decision. All these skills within these 5 competency areas are integral to a child's well-being in the home, school, and community, as also shown in the graph on the slide. Next, please. SEL is sometimes confused with the PSS, psychosocial support, and people don't really understand, what is the difference between the two, if there is any difference. SEL and PSS are actually complementary, and they both aim at improving children's well-being. Focusing on education, they both help students to effectively cope with crises and achieve learning outcome. The main differences that we can highlight is that PSS is actually a range of techniques that vary according to the individual needs. Someone might need to be engaged in a peer discussion group, while someone else might need to be more in a PFA, psychological first aid session. PSS can also be preventive, curative, or promotive. If we look at SEL, SEL is specific for the education sectors and builds upon children's skills to reduce negative developmental and behavioral effects of exposure to crises and to help them to learn, cope, and succeed. Looking at the MHPSS intervention pyramid, you can see that SEL stands between the second and the third levels, which are community and family support and focus non-specialized support. Next slide, please. If we think about why SEL is key for education program and is currently one of the priorities for Save the Children education global theme for 2019 and 2021? Well, because well-being is critical for establishing a strong foundation for learning. A child who cannot regulate emotion or is not socially aware will likely struggle while sitting in a class and learning to read and do math. Evidence shows that social emotional learning can help children not only dealing with adverse effects of negative life events, but also increase their concentration, their sense of control, improve behavioral conduct, and contribute to more positive attitudes towards learning. SEL programs have an impact on both children and teachers. You can see on the slide some of the effects that SEL has in terms of retention, students' behaviors, learning outcome, health, protection. And I also link the paper that the Interagency Network for Education Emergency, INE, has produced on 2016 for your reference. Save the Children aspires for all children to survive, learn, and be protected. And evidence shows that SEL contributes to both children's learning and protection. SEL is critical promoting safe and protective learning environments. For example, SEL skills such as emotional regulation and empathy are crucial for reducing peer violence, including bullying. From the learning side, researches in emergency context shows that when a child's education includes social and emotional learning, they often demonstrate stronger preparedness for learning and achievement in school. Let's now see what Save the Children does in Iraq to support children's well-being. Next slide, please. Save the Children is a centenarian global movement that believes that every child, every last child, deserves a future. In Iraq, Save the Children has been operational since 1991, responding to the humanitarian, recovery, and development needs of children and families that have been affected by conflict. Save the Children currently works in 5 governorates: Dohuk, Ninawa, Saladin, Kirkuk, and Diyala, responding to the protection, education, mental health, and psychosocial needs of children. We also have cash programming and work in communities to restore water and sanitation facilities and infrastructure. We have an education intervention in all the area highlighted on the map. And our program supports IDPs, Syrian refugees, returnees, and host community children, both in terms of access to and quality of education. We also work to strengthen and improve the education system, advocating for policy change and building national capacity. Save the Children education intervention includes different levels of education. Pre-primary, we have a very strong ACCD, Early Childhood and Care and Development program, primary and post-primary for adolescents. As the country is now transitioning from an emergency phase to a more recovery and development, the whole education team, together with me, is engaged in developing an education strategy for 2019 until 2021, in line with the country's strategy plan. And we have identified children's and teacher well-being as a key area that we should continue to focus on, considering the change at context level, but also in terms of children needs. Children's well-being is addressed at a different level through education, child protection, and MHPSS mental health and psychosocial support activities. Looking at the education specifically, children's well-being is a key component of teacher professional development. We have a project that through art aims to support healing, and it's one of the ultimate goals when it comes to create safe learning spaces where children learn and are protected. Focusing on SEL, it's incorporated in all education projects, supporting children from 3 to 17 years old. SEL is one of the topics included in the teacher professional development package, so the teacher training, and goes together with a training on literacy and numeracy using Save the Children package called Learning and Wellbeing in Emergency. This is applied to both teachers in the formal governmental schools, as well as to the education facilitators who run non-formal education in the alternative learning spaces. I want to add one note before giving back the floor to Annie and to Daoud from The Hook. As part of our continuous learning process, in Iraq now we are working on better defining how we can measure improvements in well-being at teacher level and how we can strengthen the linkages between SEL in school and the activities, the services in terms of mental health and PSS that the other colleagues are providing in and out of school. So this is something that we are further developing and try to better understand, especially in terms of how to measure these improvements. Thanks, and I'm passing now the microphone to my colleague Alison.
Thank you, Chiara. And that teacher well-being emphasis sounds very interesting. I'd love to chat more about that. And thanks for the summary of social and emotional learning and well-being programming in Iraq. So the International Social and Emotional Learning Assessment, or ISELA, is a tool to help us measure the competencies and programming that Chiara discussed. So ISELA measures the development of social and emotional learning skills in children between the ages of 6 and 12 years old, and whether this development differs by key equity factors such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, exposure to adversity, and interpersonal threats in the learning environment and in the environment around the child. It includes 5 subdomains: self-concept, stress management, perseverance, empathy, building relationships, and solving conflict. It also includes measures about children's experiences in the learning environment and potential for the exposure to risk. So ISELA is specifically designed to support learners in tenuous environments like emergency settings, and it's an inclusive direct child assessment, and its game-based approach makes it unique in measuring social and emotional learning worldwide. Next slide, please. So ISELA helps us understand the development of social and emotional learning competencies. It can be used cross-sectionally with only one measurement time point. ISELA provides an aggregate profile of children's social and emotional learning competencies and the interpersonal environment in the school or community. This can help us make decisions about specific components of the program that needs to be added or amended. When used alongside assessments of academic skills like literacy and numeracy, it contributes to a more holistic profile of children's development. When used longitudinally, with multiple points across time for the same child, ISELA can provide an aggregate picture of how different social and emotional learning skills change over time with the use of repeated measures for the same child, like a pre and post test. It can be used either with a control or comparison group. It can help us understand if changes in children's social and emotional learning was affected by an intervention or program in which they were participating. That being said, ISELA is not a diagnostic or placement tool. It was not designed to be used to identify which children require targeted psychological counseling or other mental health programming. This is more to get a view of the child's social and emotional learning as they progress, as they age. With all that being said, the ISELA pilot in Dohuk was used to create a profile of children in programming in 2 refugee camps. And so, Dowd, I'll just turn it over to you for further information about that pilot, and we can address any questions about the use of ISELA at the end.
Thank you, Alison. Hi, everybody. As Alison said, ISELA pilot project was implemented in the Hook during October 2018 to March 2019. The first step that we have done, we reviewed the assessment tool and we contextualized the tool to become more relevant to the area of assessment. Then it was followed by simply size the assessment. We collect the data from principal of 10 schools and we indicate few children within grade 1 to 4 and it was selected randomly. And then after that we translate the tools from English to Arabic, and then at the end we translate the result of assessment from Arabic to English as well. For that purpose, we hired 20 enumerators, which we have trained them on the ISELA tool, and we review all the tool one by one together to make sure that we all understand. We all understand in the same page.
Well, save. Yeah. It's good though. It's good.
Okay.
Lots of.
So then
We're making good change.
okay, and then we during the training consists of 2 days of practical session. We took the enumerator to the camps and we did some pilot test assessment, and we give our feedback to the enumerator to become more varied and more accurate and more qualified for doing the ISELA assessment. And after that, we start the assessment. The assessment took about 10 days. And at the end of each day, we debrief whatever we saw, because we were monitoring the assessment and to becoming better and to improve better for the coming days. So next slide, please. Okay. So during the assessment, we recognize that students, they are feeling very nervous, but our enumerators explain to them the purpose of the assessment, and that makes them very comfortable during the assessment. This is followed, we give children some refreshment, plus our enumerator from time to time did some energizers and games to bring the concentration of the children back to the assessment whenever they need. On the other hand, the assessment consists of 2 parts. The first part was done by enumerators, and the second part was done by the teachers of those students who participate on the assessment. So the second part was called the social competency form, which was filled out by the teachers. So teachers, when they saw that we are assessing children for their social and emotional learning, they were very excited, and they really support us to filling out the social competency tools, and on some occasions, some of the teachers, they were struggling on Arabic language of the tools because they were not able, their comprehension level for understanding Arabic was not so good. So our enumerators help them and translate the tools to them to Kurdish to make sure they are filling the competency form in a correct way. And at the end of the assessment, teachers also ask us if we are able to share the result of the ISELA with them in order to make them better understanding of social emotional learning of the children. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. So during the assessment time, we saw one of the teachers who has been trained on the SEL, social and emotional learning, and he thanks the trainer of the SEL, and she said that the SEL was one of the best training she ever been because SEL helped her a lot during the day. Before she took the SEL training, she was not able to control the classroom, and most of their children, the students, they were not able to understand, and their comprehension level for numeracy and literacy was very bad. But after she enrolled to the SEL training, she was able to manage her classroom better and better, and uh, and hence the children get benefit from them a lot, and they were able to read their names and write numbers as well. And another part of our normal activity is spot checklist assessment, which we are doing at the beginning of the formal year and at the end. So during the end line of the spot check assessment, when we did in our school in Duhok, we found that lots of formal teachers, non-formal teachers, and also facilitators, they are using a lot of SEL competency skills during their normal explanation of the lessons. Next slide, please. Okay. We face also some challenges during ISLA implementation. One of them was time and timing, because the time that we did the ISLA, a lot of schools have different events such as Kurdish Cloth Day and international student days, and most of students, they were busy with celebration and party, so that makes some delay for our assessment. And another trouble or challenge we faced was translation of the tool. As you know, the tool was translated it was in English and it was translated to Arabic. And the children on the camp, they are speaking Syrian Kurdish language. So at the end, the result must be translated again to English. This is make the possibility of biased results sometimes. It was not hard to control translation. The another challenge we faced was random selection of children. We took the registration form from headmasters and we select randomly some children. But while we were doing the assessment, we find out some of these children, they left the school for different reasons, whether they went back to Syria or they traveled to Europe, they were not there. So we face some issues with finding same children in the school. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Alison, I will come back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dowd. I think you summarized well the the contextualizing challenges that we face in the field of using any of these tools, even the training content, to make sure that it's relevant. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the findings and implications of the findings from the social emotional learning assessment that we used. And then we can really open this up to questions because I see there are a lot there, many of them directed specifically at the Iraq office. So very briefly, of the 620 children assessed in grades 1 to 4, children's grade in school was the most strongly significant predictor of better social emotional learning assessment scores across all of the subdomains. So that's the self-concept, stress management, perseverance, empathy, and conflict resolution. Grade was a stronger predictor of social and emotional competence than children's reported environmental threats or risk factors. So the main takeaway from the pilot related to ICELA was the tool's reliability and validity in context. ICELA validly and reliably measures the concepts of self-concept, stress management, perseverance, empathy, and conflict resolution skills for Syrian refugee children in Iraq. So the tool can be used by groups of assessors reliably in this context for skills monitoring, program evaluations, or impact studies. This is very useful when we're thinking about future programming and knowing whether or not how we will measure this very difficult to measure social and emotional learning and children's well-being. So given the trauma of displacement and related experience of violence, isolation, and turmoil, supporting social and emotional learning development and overall mental well-being for girls and boys in emergency contexts is critical. This is just one tool that we can use towards assessing, and then on top of that, all of the programming that we've discussed. So I think we can turn it over now to question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, Chiara, and Dowd for that, for your presentations and overview on what's social emotional learning, how it takes place in Iraq, and how you've measured it through this pilot, and your overall findings and implications for programs. There are quite a few questions here in the chat box, and I'll start off with, let's see, just scrolling up to the first questions here, and maybe you can just talk a little bit more to social emotional learning and how that relates to other approaches for whether it's participatory learning or positive discipline, and is it possible to separate those out, or is it quite overlapping, would you say? And also from your experience from implementing social emotional learning interventions as a standalone activities in training teachers and also children, and also incorporating it within your numeracy and literacy work, how different is it when you do it standalone versus integrated within regular teaching? Would you like to take that question first, and then we can look at some of the questions on measurement?
Maybe I can answer about this SEL, if it's different compared to positive discipline approaches, or you were saying classroom management. Well, they are all linked, I would say. I mean, when SEL, I'm just thinking when we do the training on literacy and social emotional learning for teacher, we are not just telling teacher, we're not just trying to improve the understanding of the teachers about children's well-being, but we're also helping them to reflect on their own well-being, to identify their own sources of stress and better manage the stress in their life and how to cope with the toxic stress. So at a moment when the teacher is more self-aware of his well-being and is working to improve it, then it's more likely than positive discipline and positive way of classroom management are going to work out with him or with her. So I would say that the two things are actually all complementing each other in a way that definitely we can do a standing alone training on positive discipline, as well as it could be done with parents in terms of parenting sessions or corporal punishment with communities. Still, when you add the level on SEL, they really have a better understanding, not only on the impact of these approaches on their children, but also how their own life is actually having an impact on how they are using these techniques. So I would say that they are actually very complementary and they reinforce each other.
Okay, thank you so much, Ciara. There's a question from Caroline Hilary in the chat box. And Caroline, I was wondering if you could unmute yourself and ask the question around gender differences in the results that we find when doing these assessments.
Yeah, hello. Hope you can hear me. I was wondering about, you said that you had the power or the strength of the assessment would allow you to look at differences such as, like, I guess, socioeconomic status, but you also mentioned gender. And I was just wondering whether the concepts of competencies actually are in a lot of cultures quite gendered. So I was wondering whether you found that girls in general were more shy to talk at all, or in terms of empathy, whether there was a difference between gender, because that's typically associated more with girls. Well, I put if the boys were more assertive, but assertiveness, I think it wasn't measured quite as explicitly. But if you could talk a little bit about the results in terms of gender differences.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We expected, honestly, to find gender differences, but across all of these domains within ICELA, there was no significant difference for boys and girls in our sample. And what that could mean is the children that we're assessing are maybe all interacting in very similar ways at the ages that they are in grades 1 through 4. It could be related to how the questions are contextualized. So one of the things you mentioned was how gender is culturally constructed in different ways in different contexts. And during the enumerator training, as well as prior to the enumerator training, as Dowd explained, we do very seriously look at how the questions are worded, how we can really contextualize, especially since it is game-based, the stories of how you would resolve a specific conflict. All of that needs to be very clearly contextualized. And during that, we have to think about how boys might respond differently than girls in particular and context. So the conflict resolution questions ask about how you would respond if another child came and pushed a girl. How you would respond, what sort of activities or what sort of things you would do for the girl, for the person who pushed, and what you think would be the reason behind that. And so in that example, we're able to see hostile attribution. We're able to measure different social and emotional learning skills, and each of those stories is contextualized. So we can either change it to it's a boy who pushed, it's a girl who pushed, it's we can change it based off of what is relevant in context. But yeah, again, we didn't find any related to gender. For SES, we did find higher SES, children with higher SES or reported SES responded to 22% more conflict resolution questions favorably, and so that was interesting. And we also found that the learning environment threats, actually, children who reported experiencing unsafe learning environments responded to more questions favorably almost across the board. And one of the things that we concluded with that is that children who responded and were aware of threats in their learning environment were likely had higher awareness of other relationships, of other stresses, were able to understand, empathy for others more because they were more observant about those particular threats that were measured. Again, it wasn't as significantly correlated as grade, but it was an interesting finding.
Caroline, does that answer your question? Would you?
Yeah, partly. I'm just so kind of struggling with the concept itself of what we're measuring is necessarily gendered, just because all of our cultures are gendered, and so. But it is interesting to see that you didn't find particular differences, and I was just wondering whether maybe, when we go through what you say contextualization, that we already take that into account when we adapt it. But thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and all of the concepts that we're measuring are based off of social emotional learning research and concepts, particularly the Castle framework. But all of those have some amount of a gendered analysis that you can find in when you're looking at the results of using those measures. So I think that it's something we have to keep in mind during contextualization, and is definitely something we keep in mind during analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, Alison. There's a question from Doug McCall on, is ICELA comparable and compatible with similar tools, and such as the strengths and difficulties questionnaire and others. Doug, did you want to speak a little more to that? You can unmute yourself.
Sure. Yeah, just quickly, there are similar tools around the world. I know of 2 or 3, but there's probably more. And is this tool, could it be put into a package where we would be able to get some sort of global picture of social emotional learning or readiness as maybe when kids enter school or when they're leaving primary school? In other words, more of a policy tool than a diagnostic or classroom-centered tool. Do you think that might be feasible in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's definitely a path we're already exploring. We're working with an INEE, the Internet Agency Network for Education in Emergencies working group, and ICELA is one of the tools that has been already mapped in their research of social and emotional learning assessments. And during the development of the tool, that was actually part of identifying what we were going to measure, is looking at the Castle framework as a start, but then also looking at what other tools are measuring and really trying to contextualize to a lower resource environment, because a lot of the social and emotional learning tools that are available were developed sort of in the West and in a higher resource environment. And so we're thinking about how we can make what we've already found in a lot of the social and emotional learning assessments relevant to a variety of contexts. So yeah, that process is definitely underway, and I believe there's a report that will be including ICELA and the mapping coming out in the beginning of next year. Though I'm not sure if all of the assessments will be publicly available on the INEE site as of now, but definitely keep an eye out for it.
Thanks. I'll follow up with INEE. And you're probably aware that Castle also has had a working group on measuring and monitoring SEL that's been going for a couple of years now. And our FRESH project that we're doing on health education is asking some people to try to pull this kind of stuff together. We have some people from the American Institute for Research taking lead on that, and maybe we can make the connection. I'll be happy to, if I could follow up with you on that.
Yes, please. You can either email the learning assessment email address that I've included in the chat, or my email is just my first initial and my last name at savechildren.org.
Perfect.
That sounds excellent. Thank you.
Great. Good to see that we're making some connections here in our work. There's a question from Sarah Hommel on the diversity of SEL promoting and MHPSS promoting activities and programming taking place in Iraq, often with multiple approaches overlapping and complementing the same classroom or CFS. How is ICELA being used to evaluate Save the Children program impact? Sarah, if you're online, would you like to speak to that question? a little more?
Sure. The question is simply that given the complexity of programming in Iraq and that Save the Children programs that promote SCL, promote psychosocial well-being and mental health are often, there are multiple projects, multiple program approaches, some that are simply trainings for facilitators to adjust their approach, some that are scheduled programmatic activities that are integrated into the classroom on a daily or weekly basis. Given that there are so many different program methodologies being used, how is it envisioned that ICELA will be used to evaluate the impact of Save the Children programming? Is it simply to look, is the intention a one-time assessment to simply get a picture of where SCL is based on this specific framework in Iraq, in the context in which we work? Or is it intended to evaluate sort of our holistic, multi-programmatic, integrated programming over time in a longitudinal evaluation? Or is there intention to eventually start disaggregating programming to demonstrate the impact of specific interventions, in which case there would be a programmatic implication where we would no longer be able to integrate every programmatic approach into every classroom or CFS, where we would actually have to control some of the environments to have certain programming components in certain classrooms and others in others. Sorry, I don't know if I made that more confusing or less confusing by speaking.
But I can chime in on the purpose of ICELA, and then Chiara, if you want to chat a little bit about the diversity of programming in Iraq and what you think of different evaluations, that I think would be interesting. So very quickly on ICELA, it is designed to be used either cross-sectionally or longitudinally. It could be used with a control or comparison group. It could be used as a profile. It could be used to track change for children over the course of a project. For each intervention, the questions you ask are going to be slightly different. So if we're looking at a longitudinal analysis, we may, as you point out, be focusing on specific skills. It really is going to depend on how the project is structured and what we really need to measure, but it can be used as a longitudinal measure. It can be used in a pre-post, in a controlled treatment, and in a cross-section, or just understanding the profile of learners. In this example, we were piloting the tool to find out if it was actually validly measuring social emotional learning for children in the two camps that we're in Dohuk. And so we were looking more at, is this a tool that we can move forward with to measure and evaluate social emotional learning more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as Ali says, I mean, the pilot itself was not aimed to monitor and evaluate a specific project, but it was more to have a picture of SEL skills of children and to see if the tools was actually relevant for the context and to measure those skills in that specific setting. Say that in Iraq, as you know very well, Sarah, we have a very complex program intervention trying to address children's well-being through mental health, PSS, child protection, and education. And definitely we are moving towards more an integration of all these instead of working in silos and divide programs between from the other in order to properly evaluate the impact of each one of them. Because as we usually say here, children are not silos. Children need to be approached from in an holistic way. So the program themselves has to be complement and to support each other. ICELA, definitely, we want to use it more as a pre-post test that really shows how the whole intervention of Save the Children towards that child has worked and which kind of impact it has in terms of SEL skills. But we are not gonna look at specifically on one project or the other, because as I said, children are actually moving across our program. we could have a child that is actually going to school, where the teacher have been trained on SEL, and then maybe he's going to the alternative learning spaces to get support in doing homework, where the facilitators as well has been trained on SEL. And then maybe in that same alternative learning space is actually doing, being part of the art project, where he's actually doing art activities, recreational activities aimed to heal. So again, you see there are really a lot of interaction, and the child itself is moving across our intervention. It could even go to the child resilience program with the child protection, could be supported by case management. So in terms of programs, here the different teams are talking each other. So we know if a child has a specific needs that has to be supported from a specific type of intervention. But then the tools that is going to measure this, it can be ICELA, but it cannot be the only one. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, we are also looking for other tools together with the MHPSS specialists here in the country, to really understand how we can understand how we can measure the improvement in terms of well-being for children, for adults, using as much as possible tools that are generally and globally accepted and let's say validated as well. So not something that we don't want to develop something specifically for a project. We want to collect data that could be analyzed for the specific project, for the specific context, but can also be compared with other countries and contexts. So it's a huge discussion, actually. I'm not sure if my answer was very clear, but I mean, it's a very complex situation, and we are really trying to understand how better we can support children and which tools can support us in understanding if we are really supporting children and addressing their needs or not. But it's still a discussion at the beginning, actually. We have not really reached the last step of it.
Thank you, Chiara. Sarah, did you have any follow-up comments on that?
Yeah, just simply that was a good answer. Thanks, Chiara. I guess I was trying to ask it in a neutral way, but there's huge bias behind my question, which is that in the past, we have seen similar quantitative evaluation tools being used in other countries where there was a lot of pressure to have a control group, which meant denying services or denying access to programming for children who were in need of said programming. And that was quite a negative thing to see happen. And so I'm very, very happy to hear your response, which is that is not the intention going forward, to withhold programming in order to have a control and demonstrate specific project impact, but rather to get a snapshot of the overall SCL environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's a really good point that you made, Chiara, also of how the ICELA tool is being used and can be used in Iraq across your portfolio of activities. And for the work that we do in school health and nutrition, for example, with the menstrual hygiene promotional activities and education, we also add emotional skills, self-efficacy, and we have questions, tools to measure that. And I guess my question or comment is for any given project that is looking at children's learning and development, if one wants to look at this dimension, they could use the ICELA tool for to give that snapshot picture of where are girls and boys with respect to achieving those age-appropriate skills. And I also wanted to come back to Caroline's earlier question about, is the tool the same for 6 to 12-year-olds and other games different for different ages? How do you, I guess, this is more of a question on how you analyze the data, but how do you set whether a child is meeting age appropriateness for for skills across those dimensions? Do you use child development benchmarks for social emotional skills? If you could speak to that a little bit, Alison or Chiara.
Yeah, we don't have any benchmarks of how we expect children to be performing on ICELA, and so we don't expect to have some sort of age-appropriate benchmark that applies to all contexts, because as we've been discussing here, everything is contextually specific. So instead, what we do is we use the same tool for all children at all ages, expecting children who are older or more advanced in school to be performing better than children who are younger. And then we can actually compare by age and by grade to understand if we're really seeing that childhood development that we would expect to see. But yeah, we don't go into a context saying we expect a second grader to be performing at a certain level because it would just be inappropriate to do across different contexts, and to compare across different contexts would be very difficult to say that there's one particular age-appropriate performance on ICELA.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and yeah, development also happens in different rates, right? Or the milestones that children reach varies a lot.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? Have I missed anything out from the chat? Is there anything more that you'd like to add to what's been asked, Alison or Chiara? Or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question. I know there's a lot of interest in your materials and the presentation and recording.
Just quickly, it's Doug McCall. I'm quite intrigued with the teacher assessments because they're less effort and less, perhaps a little less connected to context. And I wondered if there's a way of working on that, because they're less labor intensive and so on. And maybe the criteria is that in the teachers' opinions, how prepared are the kids coming into school or leaving primary school? That's kind of the research question that we might try to answer, because going into a sort of standardization process, even within the context of emergency context or high resource context, that's a very big task to develop those tools to measure student readiness or student learning in SEL. But maybe the teacher assessment is a more practical first step. I'm not sure, but that's, sorry if I'm musing a bit, but I think it's challenging, this area, because it's challenging to measure anything, but challenging to measure this area of learning.
Yeah, that's really why we do the game-based approach, because we can get a proxy when working directly with children. But for the teacher results on the social competency assessment that we use in DOHOC, I think the results are still pending. We're conducting a confirmatory factor analysis to look at those results in comparison to the ICELA results, which is another publication that should be out next year. And we're looking at really what do the teachers really, we're assuming that the teachers know and have a good gauge of children's social and emotional learning and well-being based off of their interactions. But when we're in emergency contexts and child-friendly spaces, and children may be coming in and out and mobile, I'm not sure that we're coming at I'm not sure that teachers are going to have that depth of understanding of the children in their classes. It's really, I think, will depend on the longevity of the program, on how long the child has been engaged in that class. But I am a little hesitant just from preliminary looking at the results and talking with teachers and sort of looking at teacher psychosocial support in thinking that teachers have some sort of all-knowing about the children in their classes. I think it actually may be better to work with parents, but another challenge in education in emergencies is identifying and contacting parents. That's just my thoughts on it.
No, thank you. Good insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our presenters and our participants for this very engaging discussion about a dimension of child development that we all work on either directly or through our other activities. And for the parents on the line, we know what how different it is, the social emotional skills and development for each child. And so a tool like this is really fantastic to get that snapshot picture and look at progression over time for the children we work with. I'd like to wrap up our webinar discussion for today. I'm sure there'll be more questions and requests. Feel free to email our presenters. If you could type in your email address, Alison, if that's okay, and Chiara and Dowd. And we'll also be posting the PowerPoint and the recording from today's webinar on a few different websites. I'll be pasting the links in the chat box momentarily. I'd also like to announce our next webinar, which is in a month from now on Tuesday, the 15th of October. And we'll be looking at the topic of holistic school-based food and nutrition education. We'll be joined by colleagues from UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, and they'll be speaking to us about their work on nutrition education and consumer awareness. So look out for the invite on that webinar. We'll be commemorating World Food Day with those talks and presentations. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your joining today. Thank you to our presenters. And I know it's really, the connection's really choppy in Iraq, but it held up for the webinar, which is great. Thank you, Dowd. We didn't hear from you in the Q&A. If there's any final comments, please feel free to write in the chat box or to unmute yourself. Thank you.